So in one of our last post-church discussions, the question came up, what is the role of the Christian faith in the current political climate that we're in? How do we engage? And after some discussion, I agreed to tackle it. I was joking before the service. This is the type of sermon ministers do not want to engage with. I was just recently reading a poll that 45% of ministers are thinking about quitting their jobs. And the number one reason, which shocked me, was that they were, in addition to salary and time, politics. They were stressed out about politics in their congregation. So it's a tough topic, but we're never shy about such things. We're going to wade in. I hope you'll forgive me if I offend anybody, but let's see what happens. Um, so many people just believe that faith and politics should remain completely separate. And I get that. You'll never hear me telling you how to vote as a pastor in a sermon. Uh, but I do believe church communities should work hard also to maintain a place for all political views. It's really important. And it's also critical for us to show how our faith guides us in the public square. Why? Because the reality is every political decision is a moral decision. Our laws reflect our values. When we prioritize our budget, that's what we're really saying is the most important thing. That's what we believe in. Now, I know that politics right now can feel very toxic. I know that many are very discouraged. Many have told me that they have just tuned it out. Don't watch the news, don't watch anything. And one member of our community has actually left the country completely a while ago. But if you're inspired by the teachings of Jesus, I don't think we can step away from politics. If we did that, we would leave a vacuum for, I believe, selfishness, greed, and fear to take over the most powerful government in the world. So if we do decide to remain engaged, how does our faith guide us? Well, this week I attended a presentation at the American Enterprise Institute featuring two books on the role of faith in public life. Ross Stohart's Believe encourages the readers to find a spiritual path. And Jonathan Rauch wrote a book called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Failed Bargain with Democracy. And he argues that today's political dysfunction is linked to the decline of a Christian church that's no longer following the teachings of Jesus. Interesting, Rauch, a secular Jewish gay atheist and a longtime friend of mine, believes that reviving Christianity and the teachings of Jesus is essential for a successful democracy. Now, in his book, he differentiates between the various types of Christians and contends that if Christians truly followed Christ's teachings, they would provide the moral foundation that our democracy needs at this time. So I completely agree with Jonathan. I think it is also very interesting that his prophetic call to Christianity comes from outside the faith, which often is the case. The outsider can see it more clearly. Interestingly, our theology, or Swedenborgian theology, offers some really interesting insights, I believe, in engaging public policy. So I wanted to share some of those perspectives. And it's pretty simple. Swedenborg taught that God's divine order is based in three pillars: love, wisdom, and usefulness, and that our government should reflect these principles. These principles of love, wisdom, and usefulness also tie nicely to the reading we had today on Micah. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. I think these are really important guides for these times. Now, we could talk about this in the abstract. That might be a little safe, but let's get into it. Let's explore how these pillars might apply to some of the most challenging political issues of our day. So let's pick the top challenging ones. Let's start with, immigration. That's an easy one. So immigration has become one of the most controversial issues of our time. How would these three pillars, love, wisdom, and usefulness, apply to immigration? Let's start with love. Swedenborg wrote that loving our neighbor is the most important action of a Christian. That's based on the teachings of Jesus, who dramatically told us in the parable of the Good Samaritan that we are to love our neighbor. This includes the stranger, the refugee, the outcast. It's not just about our family and friends, it's beyond that. And in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, it says, the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself. You were foreigners in Egypt. Swedenborg expands on this, teaching that this society should also reflect the structure of heaven, where he said each soul is valued. But he points out that love is not enough. We always have to have love with wisdom. Love must be applied with wisdom or truth. Love without this wisdom or truth can enable harmful behavior. So good government requires this wisdom as well to balance out the compassion and love. And immigration laws should be enforced fairly. That would be the wisdom. If people who wait for years for legal immigration see others bypass the system, trust in the entire system is eroded. And David Frum put it this way a while back, but I think it's hard hitting, but it's pretty accurate. If liberals won't enforce their borders, fascists will. America thrives on immigration, but rapid, unregulated migration can cause harm to those who are already struggling. A compassionate yet lawful approach is essential. So how do we balance this compassion with this justice? If we applied this, we would say we need borders, but not barriers to human dignity. We need legal pathways, but not punitive laws that dehumanize. We need policies based on reason, not fear. Now, in our polarized system, we often feel forced to support either Democrats or Republicans. And when we vote, that's very often the only option. But as we seek to offer a Christian-inspired solutions to these issues, we shouldn't be co-opted by either party. Political parties often present overly simplistic solutions. Very often they err on the side of being compassion without truth, or truth with no compassion. I encourage us to think beyond party lines and instead seek the balance, love, truth, and usefulness. Okay, so that's just a quick look at immigration. What about the limits in the role of government? Another very hot topic right now. Some want to expand the role of government and others want to eliminate it. So Swedenborg described government as a necessary part of the divine order, not for control, but to ensure justice. He also warned that we should be aware in government that there will be those who will be attracted to it as corrupt leaders who seek to serve themselves rather than the people. During a presentation I was giving to government employees in January, I was touched by one of the participants when she said, I accepted my calling to public service 20 years ago. And I just have to tell you, there was something in the conviction of her voice that it hit me emotionally. It hits me in the heart. It made me tear up as I heard it. She was speaking about service. She was seeking to be useful. Government was for her a form of service to the nation, a calling. And this is what we need. And this is also a time where these folks who are in that role are being treated very badly. The actions by the current administration are truth, we need to downsize, without love. It's not useful, it's actually cruel, and it will come back to bite us. It's driven by a contempt. There's been a cruelty in the way Doge has engaged with civil servants, and that's the opposite of compassion. You could argue there was a failure in the last administration to rein in the size of the government. I could agree with that. And that there's a failure in the way it could be accomplished. But the way that it's being done with the cruelty right now and the unpredictability and chaos is not good. And it will come back to bite us. Now, this is an example where the parties have failed, I think, but we need a balanced approach, a nuanced approach to bring back balance. There has to be both truth with compassion. Another area that's been very much in the news lately has been the debt. Both parties have been running up deficits that will land on the next generation. If we married compassion with wisdom, we could avoid the blind expansion or just draconian cuts. Instead, we could seek wise reform. We could have a matrix that says if a program serves the common good, we keep it. But if it serves the powerful, we reform it. If it's ineffective, we cut it. The question isn't really big government versus small government. It's, is it useful? Does it serve the people? Another critical area that is risen up right now in our time is the power of the executive branch. Yes, I'm going there. The American system is built on three branches: judicial, legislative, and executive. The legislative branch, elected by the vast majority of people in local districts, creates the laws and allocates funding. The executive branch, represented by an elected president, enacts the laws, while the judicial branch ensures fairness and constitutionality and plays referee when there's disputes. In recent decades, during both Democrat and Republican presidencies, we've seen the legislative branch abdicate its role and give it to the executive branch. One of the best examples of this was President Obama saying, "I've got a pen and I've got a phone," when he said he wasn't waiting for the Congress to act, meaning he would do things through executive orders. Now, as Congress over many decades now has relinquished their responsibility, we've witnessed an imbalance in our system where power has shifted from the legislative branch into the executive and judicial branches. How does our theology help navigate this? Well, Swedenborg warns us against selfish love of power and dominion. A Swedenborgian response to the overreach of the executive power would be to resist any system that crushes freedom, instead of advocating for dialogue, ethical governments, and justice. So in this moment, I think it's important for us, if we want to promote freedom of thought and act, we need to demand that our congressional members re-engage. Now, it's also important when we're looking at this to not fall into the trap of blind loyalty to my party was right, their party is wrong. If you thought increasing the court was a good idea or ending the filibuster in the last administration through executive order was a good idea, then that's part of the problem too. It's not just about whoever's in. It's not about winner takes all. We have to have these balances of power regardless of what administration's in office. And at the same time, we trust in divine providence. We believe God is working through all things, and we can engage in that, knowing that God is working for good in this moment, and God is counting on us to act. Another important area for Christians to engage in the public square is on the side of truth. Now, we often focus on the compassionate side of Jesus, the compassionate side of Christianity, and that's good. And there are also times when we need to emphasize the truth and keep the balance. And this is often called the prophetic side of Jesus. When our political leaders lie, we must be very careful not to go along to get along. We must say, this is not true. During the end of the Biden administration, the president and his team lied to the public about his cognitive status, creating a more cynical public and possibly costing the Democrats the election. But very dramatically this last week, President Trump said that Ukraine started the war with Russia. That simply and absolutely is not true. We need to say, it is not true. We must ask, why is he saying something that's obviously not true? We must ask our elected officials and his appointees to respond to this statement. What's concerning now is the United States is reverting back to a pre-traditional worldview where might makes right and great powers divide the globe up into the areas they control. Why in the world would we be antagonizing our best neighbors, Mexico and Canada, for no reason? Why are we burning bridges with our closest allies in Europe? Why lie about Ukraine and praise Russia? This spiral and the survival of the strong global order will eventually come back to haunt us, as we will see an increase in regional wars run by authoritarian governments, such as China and Russia. And it won't be long before those forces join up against us. So ironically, in our call to be peacemakers, we can't sit idly by while we revert to a might makes right upending of world peace. And that's a very important role our military has played in protecting us. So when we hear things that are not true, our greatest use is to say, this is not true, and not go along to get along. By applying the pillars of love, wisdom, and usefulness, we can engage in politics with integrity and purpose, ensuring that governance reflects divine order rather than domination and oppression. It also requires us to engage in the public sphere. Our theology teaches that faith is not just about what we believe, it's about what we do. When we're looking at policies, we have to ask, does this policy help or harm people? Are we serving others or just ourselves? Are we engaging politics to build up or to tear other people down? Again, the passage from Micah is a good guide. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. And that being humble at the very end might be the hardest part. We need to resist the temptation to call out those who we disagree with stupid. We need to avoid memes. We need to avoid blame and shame of those we disagree with, because no one is persuaded by shame. People will respond when they sense that you care and you care about shared values. So we need to engage in the public square and release the contempt we have for others. And we need to practice compassion. And the ability to love others is not something we have developed within ourselves. It's God coming through us. Our contempt and hatred of other citizens will not save us or protect us. Understanding others does not mean you agree with them. It means you've heard them and you understand them. Our nation has been engaged in decades of a vicious cycle of contempt that we've had for each other. And the only way out of this is the compassion, married to wisdom, that leads to useful action. What can we do? We can do this by building up leaders aligned to love, wisdom, and usefulness. We need to create and find leaders that promote policies of compassion and justice. We need to create and support leaders who govern with reason and balance, not ideology. And we ourselves need to engage in politics in the form of service that's not self-interest. And as a community of Church of the Holy City, we have a role to play too. One comment from a few members who joined our community said it's the only church in DC that I didn't feel like was an arm of one of the political parties. Let's keep it that way. At Church of the Holy City, we're radically ecumenical. We welcome all people on all spiritual paths. And we also have committed ourselves to practicing training in bridging divides. This is a moment to foster dialogue that unites rather than divides. To do this, we must increase our own compassion, increase our wisdom, and constantly ask God each day in prayer, how can I be most useful? Politics should not be about power or partisanship. It should be about creating a society that reflects heaven's justice and love. And if we don't bring our faith into politics, who will? May we be wise, compassionate, and useful in our churches, our community, and yes, and even in our politics. Amen.
Well said.
Thanks, Jimmy.
I'm in tears. I'm literally in tears.
Reverend Rich, I don't want to comment on any particular policy, but I want to echo Jimmy. That was a really wise, compassionate, and useful sermon, and I, for one, am extremely moved and grateful to be part of this community.
Thank you, Jose.
Well, you make it all sound very simple. I think you could spend, you could write a book on dozens on many of the topics that you brought up and still not cover everything. So the only thing I'll ask you then, given that I don't think any of this has been developed enough, is that don't you think that love implies usefulness? But there is really no such thing as love in the sense that a lot of people mean it by our action. We demonstrate our love by what we do, so that we really only need to focus on the first two, love and wisdom. And usefulness is implied by them.
Yeah, a lot of people, particularly in churches, I found travel in the world of ideas. They talk about things, they debate things, they read books, and so they travel in the world. And what I love about usefulness is it's like at some point you must take this into the world. What are you doing about it? Specifically, what actions are you taking? Not so the principles are important, but I like the idea, the usefulness that's stressed is it's action. So that's how I would interpret that. But thank you. And it could be further developed for sure.
Yeah, Rich, I think you struck just the right note, and what you said seems to me to be consistent with Jesus' maxim about rendering unto Caesar and rendering unto God. I suppose ultimately what religion can best do when it comes to our politics is to help form citizens who individually embody the virtues that you were presenting, and leads them to responsible and useful contributions to the politics of the country. Ultimately, I think it comes down to that. I've always been rather offended by churches that insist on striking an institutional pose, and I guess partly that reflects my experience with my own son, John, who as a youngster attended a Catholic school, and he and all the other students, whatever their religion might be, were mobilized once each year to go and demonstrate on the mall against various issues that the Roman Catholic Church opposed. We do seem to be getting away from that, I think, and if we are, that is good. But ultimately, it comes down to the individual and his and her reflection of Christian virtues in deciding the way our country is governed.
Yeah, I would agree with you that we need spiritual formation to have to live a virtuous life and to bring that into the public square. We're suffering. I think Jonathan Rauch is onto something, that we're suffering from the loss of that we took it for granted. And it's interesting about give unto Caesar that which is Caesar. In another podcast later that week, Jonathan Rauch was on a podcast with another friend of mine, Andrew Sullivan, who kind of made the case that there's not a Christian response and used that passage, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, meaning we're not, that in a way that there isn't a Christian way to engage, because we should just in our civic life be one thing and in our religious life another. And so that's another interpretation of it. It's kind of an interesting, I hadn't thought about it. And he just said that there really is no public policy you can take from the scriptures. So, but it is interesting how that stuck with me, and in some ways inspired me too to want to write this sermon, because I do believe there's a faith role in public policy.
Rich, at the risk of sounding less spiritual, there was a phrase you used that I'd never heard before that was interesting. if liberals won't defend the borders, then fascists will. Um, so I believe 1993 was the last time our immigration laws were changed. And I'm constantly reminding some people that in 2013, the Senate passed a bipartisan bill that Lindsey Graham voted for, and which would have easily passed the House, but the Republican speaker would not bring it up because he was afraid of violating that silly rule that says, if a majority of my caucus won't support it, I won't bring it up. And then last year, the senator from Oklahoma, a genuine conservative, worked very hard to create a bipartisan bill, the most conservative bill that Democrats would ever have accepted. And then Trump killed it because he would rather run on the issue than do anything to improve it. So when I hear if liberals don't defend the border, fascists will, I think there's a backstory that makes it a little bit hard to stomach that motto, even though it may be true.
Yeah, I thought it was a very pointed quote from David Frum, but I think the point is if compassionate people don't respond to these things, generally the public will turn to more aggressive. I think that's kind of what the point of it was. And yeah, I know we could go into debate about into a long history of the immigration issue, and everything you said was absolutely true. You just described, but I think that the balance of compassion and truth would have been better there. Annabelle, you have your hand up, and there's a
Yeah. So I'm thinking about, what we can do as a church at this point, like concretely what we can do. And, I would love to see our new home really become a place, a safe place for people to come together and just think together and learn to kind of care about each other at a deeper level than our aligned political views. Just really create space for that. And I think learning to have conversations again, I think is so critical to making things better for our entire country. And I think we need to share more useful tips for how to do that. How do we have conversations again that would lead to real understanding and compassion? So yeah, I was just wondering if we could start to think about it more concretely.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I really do believe that this new building, at this time, at this specific moment, is given to us for a purpose that you're describing, to be a space for those dialogues. I think it's no accident that you're the president of the church. Very diverse background in coming to faith again, like coming to a church. Never thought yourself would be president of a church. And but nationally, you're one of the people that's seen as who holds dialogues constantly. And also, you come from like a more strong progressive background. Yet you've held a lot of meetings with conservatives over the years, and you've worked really hard at that. So I think your skill set's going to be very important to teach that too. And you have a huge following. So anyway, I think that all fits in, and I agree completely that our space, nothing would make me happier than our space would be known as a place where you can go for meaningful conversations and dialogue. Nothing would make me happier. I think that's the critical thing right now. So um, I'm all in favor, Madam President. And thank you for being part of our community with that skill set. Let me read Mateus's question, then I'll go to Natalia. He says, Rich, I love the sermon. My question is this: why do you think so many individuals in this country who do believe that Christianity should influence politics come to really ideological and partisan results rather than the virtues you discuss? So many devout individuals on the Christian right do not represent moderation, love, or wisdom, but instead take extreme moral and intolerant moral views. Thank you, Matthias. So why do I think that's the case? I think our politics right now is almost like a spin cycle in a dryer. Okay, it's spinning, and in that spin cycle, it's spinning people into two parties. Everybody feels like they've got to choose one because it's a battle versus good versus evil. And as our Christian faith and any kind of faith deteriorates in the culture and gets weaker, people are using politics as their faith, which is very frightening. Politics can never be a substitute for faith. It's just a means of serving people. So I think that's what's happening. If 82% of Christian evangelicals supported President Trump, his most powerful group of support, and if you want me to, you're asking why do I think that's the case? Speaking from their perspective, I think they're very afraid of the secular culture that was condescending to them, that was critical of them. I think they thought they were going to lose their way of life. They were going to lose raising their children. They wanted to raise their children. So it was deep, deep fear. And these are the same folks who completely spoke out about President Clinton because of his extramarital affair, and then completely abandoned that issue dramatically with the current administration. So how does that happen? Because I'm afraid, and I want a strong person to protect me. And we were kind of told we're out of the game, and this guy's bringing us back in. If you want to think about it as like a bouncer or something like that, you're a strong person who puts you back in the game. I think that's kind of what happened, and that would be my explanation of why folks have gotten. And the mainline church in many ways has kind of sided very much with the Democratic Party. I was on the board of the National Council of Churches. It was really aligned almost completely policy-wise to the Democratic Party, and I just think that alignment, not being complicated and not being free, is unhealthy. But I understand the spin cycle. The good versus evil. A lot of pastors also are being threatened by their congregation members who say to them, like, if you don't preach on this week, I'm out of here. And that's happening all across the country. And you've never done it to me ever. No one's ever done that in this church, but I'm just telling you, pastors live in fear of their congregations. You vote me out because I didn't preach in favor of somebody, and I lose my house, I lose my income, so it's very threatening. So that's, I think, what's driving also a lot of pastors who are very stressed out about this, and the ones who stand up in their communities often are fired. So that's what I hope that explains your question of what's going on with some of the churches based on my experience. Okay, great answer. Good. Natalia, you're next.
Oh, yeah. Hello, everyone, and Pastor. Thank you, Pastor Rich. It's a very meaningful sermon, and I just want to comment in relation to what you mentioned about lies. It's really scary how lies are sound from the highest office in the country, and not many people even are trying to dismantle, even though some people do. And I see this rather as some spiritual moments, and even to the point of revelations from the Bible, because in Daniel 9:27, it says that the Antichrist will appear as a peaceful leader, and people will believe him, and he will claim he will bring stability, and he even may sign a major peace agreement, and the world will admire and follow him. It's in Revelation 13. But halfway through his rule, he will turn violent and oppose God openly. And this is when his rule ends, when Jesus returns and destroys him. Again, Revelation 19. So it sounds like really dark, and I don't know whether it's coming now. At least it seems to some people. And there is even a book by Lawrence Mulhauser's The Fourth Beast. And the subtitle is Donald Trump, the Antichrist. So, and Lawrence explores the attributes of the Antichrist and compares them to president's behavior. So I don't know, what do you think of that? But this is something that came to my mind.
As far as I do think it is, I think it is a dark time that we're coming into, so I'm worried. So I'm not going to be Pollyanna about that. As far as Daniel's prediction and Revelations, I just know that historically, every generation on both sides have used those passages to speak about the leaders that they didn't like. So I think we have to be very cautious in predicting that this is the beast or this is the thing. I worry about that because if we that makes it like, well, if we're fighting against Satan, that justifies a lot of things. So so anyway, I don't think Donald Trump is the Antichrist. I guess is the most direct way I could answer that question. Yeah, and I think that politicians have misused power historically, and leaders have it historically. But I think, yeah. So anyway, I don't necessarily align with that interpretation, but I can see why people do that in every generation. I think Revelations and Daniel have been used to, when I grew up, the bear in Revelations was described as Russia and so on and so forth. So I've seen it every generation. Israel, there's people who believe it so much that they support Israel on it because of an interpretation on foreign policy, which I don't think is really founded in biblical scholarship. So anyway, I think it happens, but I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that. Pastor Peter, Chaplain Peter.
Let's go with Chaplain Peter, since these are or Pastor Peter, sorry, since these are my opinions and not the DOD. I'm a chaplain. I obviously have every right to speak as a citizen and as a clergy person. And Rich, I just really appreciate virtually everything you've said. It really resonates with my interpretive method, with the scriptures that I hold up is really dear to me. I was asked, not a church I belong to, but I was asked to write a short devotion for the season that we're coming into here very soon in Lent. They have one for every day. And they assigned me a scripture, and it was one from the book of James, chapter 1, verse 27. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Kind of where I went with that little reflection, thought starter, was those examples of orphans and widows are not meant to be an exhaustive list of those we're called to care for, and kind of the clear focus. Though Jesus did welcome soldiers. There weren't too many sailors around that I knew of, so it's definitely included others, and it included those people in power. But the number of times that phrases like that are used, and people are named in scripture, such as the stranger 68 times, the sick 93 times, the poor 202 times, the alien 121 times. These are examples of the one that in this love that gives expecting nothing to return, which is to quote Jesus, is really a strong care element. I'm just going to say one more thing. I love the podcast that you gave, and Rauch had some good things to say for sure. When he says he kind of said we have to divorce ourselves from politics in a way, and I think that gets to your last answer about linking yourself exclusively with a political party, which is pretty much anti-constitutional. It gets really close to calling on who you should be voting for, like you acknowledge you would never do that. So that's really good. Another friend of yours is Haidt, that wrote The Righteous Mind, and he talks about the different sensors that lead us to making moral decisions being common or kind of across humanity, but different ones are brought up to different people. And that care harm principle, as I recall, one of the first ones conservatives and liberals both are elicited by the care of others and protection. It just tends to be that some of us feel we have a calling, a responsibility, and inspired by Christ to care for those who may not get us anything in return, and who may be the voiceless and the diminished ones. And so that's where you get some differences, while others on the other side may say, sure, I care for people, my family. I mean, I need to do my very narrow plan. It's a genuine care response, protecting them from harm. But what we're seeing with some of the choices that I always have is, who are those that we're advocating for? And the question of, is it really self-serving or not? And agape love, which is certainly a love that Christ holds up, is a disinterested, not a self-serving love. And that informs. So what I like to say is, no, we can't use traditions. It's not a Lutheran country, so I can't use priorities for my kind of Lutheranism to make a place in the public sphere. But I do, and we all do, have religiously informed policy positions, and that leads us to go a certain direction with how we exercise our faith in the world today. And yeah, I thank you for letting me be here. There's so many things you've prompted to think about and respond to, but just thanks again for that.
Well, we're honored that you're here, honored for your service to our country. And you've been on my mind because I think your role is going to become more complicated. You're going to have more people, you're going to have layoffs, you're going to have the leadership is being completely changed. And so in a very uncompassionate way. So anyway, I've been thinking about you, and we'll keep you in our prayers, because our military, as you know, I'm a big supporter of our military, because I do believe it leads to peace. It protects us. And I think that if it's used in a different way, we're going to lose that. So I'm worried about it. So thank you for your service, and thank you for your comments. And yeah, I appreciate it. And I appreciate your comments.
Let me just make one more quick comment that I think is relevant, very quick. I have been reading something about the early Greek philosophers, and Socrates is reported to have said, when asked about what do you have to say about creating a just society, Socrates was very interested in justice, and he said, I have nothing to say about it. I promote that by living justly. And I relate that to Christianity. It's the Christian life that's going to save us, not talking about it, but living it.
True.
Thank you.
True. Daniel writes, thank you for the sermon, Rich, and taking on this difficult subject. One thing I keep thinking about is truth, and how we seem to have just lost it in a natural sense of the truth. We know from the Bible and our own lived experience how important truth is. But for example, I was listening to Meet the Press, and it's just incredible how people can speak about the one subject, and it's almost like they're talking about two different things. Some of the political maneuvering, but a lot of it is living in a world now where we can't agree on what truth is. I don't know how to fix this. Interesting, Daniel, in my training on cultural translation, I can talk more about it, but I actually make the case that we're living in a world now where there's three different ways of seeing the truth. A traditional way that says the truth comes into the world through scripture and through the prophets. So my truth is from my faith. A modern way that says truth is only what I can measure. It's only through the scientific method, only what can be replicated. If I can't touch it, I can't experience it, I can't experiment on it, it's not real. So there's no truth. So that's the truth, what I can see and feel. And then there's a postmodern worldview that says, my truth is my truth. Your truth is your truth. My lived experience is my truth. Your lived experience is your truth. There is no capital T truth. And in fact, anybody who's pushing a capital T truth has an agenda. It's a power dynamic. So these are really three different ways we look at the truth. What's interesting in the training, Daniel, is that all of us have a little piece of those worldviews within us. We're all living in this sort of contradiction of how you get to truth. I'm a pastor, so as you know, I open this old book each week. I'm talking about this 2,000-year-old person, Jesus. That's very traditional, and I'm guided by my faith. So that's very traditional. I've also very modern guy. I believe in science, and I believe I've worked in the social impact space with investors, and that's a truth. And I also, having, particularly as a gay person, I'm really sensitive to my truth is my, whose truth, and the truth that's been left out. And by my experience is different from yours. So anybody who's an outsider kind of sympathizes a little bit with my truth is my truth. So I think you've nailed something really important here, that there is a variety of truth statements and we're talking through each other right now. So in those television shows, what's also important to realize is postmodernism, which is most often perceived as from the left, as the woke culture. Also, there's a postmodern right that has emerged, and that's where you're getting fake news, anti-vax, anti-corporate, and also the identity they're pushing. The identity on the left would be minority categories: gay, African American, Native American, Hispanic, women. On the right, they're pushing a Christian European white male identity that they feel has been victimized and left behind. So that, I hope that explains a little bit of the various truth statements that's going on right now. At least that's my take. And Annabelle, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of answers what Daniel just asked. But I just want to say a couple of things about, based on everything that I've done over time in terms of organizing politically. I think people underestimate how powerful individual citizen actually is. Like if they decide to organize, it's amazing what can be accomplished. And yeah, and two, I think the best way to really connect with people who might have a different truth is to not focus on trying to change their truth, but to show them that you care about them. And then they just become much more receptive to at least hearing your take on things.
Yeah, I think that a lot of great wisdom in that. Can you give us an example? Right now, a lot of people are saying, I don't know how to engage as an individual.
Yeah.
There's nothing an individual, I'll just summarize it. There's nothing an
Mhm.
individual can do right now. I am powerless.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
would you say to that?
Okay, well, actually, I've been putting together an organizing project that I'm calling the Kitchen Table Alliance, of asking people to organize in their community discussions where people can really share what's happening for them in terms of like their, day-to-day issues that, because a lot of people are hurting, but to also repair the relationship that's really broken about trust. Like we don't trust each other, we don't feel like people care, we feel rejected, we don't feel included, but really creating an inclusive space, and not focusing on trying to change our minds. And once we start to form those relationships, then we can advocate together for things that would help people in our community, at every level of government, but also just as a community. And so, yeah, if people are interested, I'm doing a bunch of Zoom calls talking to different people about it, and you can send me a message, and I would love to send you an invite to it.
You heard it here, folks. The Kitchen Table Alliance launched at Bell Park, Church of the Holy City. I think it's brilliant. I love that it's kitchen table because it's the things that people care about. And one thing that people do really care about is their economics, and they want to have a financial stability for themselves and their family. And I think that
Mhm.
drives a lot of things. And I think if you're talking about that, um,
Yes.
yeah, and I think you're getting it. It's interesting because you're in West Virginia, in very red
Mhm.
Trump country, and you're more blue. So I think you're where you're doing it is quite interesting. It's not like you're organizing necessarily in a very homogenous area. So I think that's helpful too.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's working. I've convinced some people, so I feel optimistic about this.
Yeah, you persuaded through compassion.
I just want to say one last, also, I think, kind of encouraging thing was a reminder out of that podcast that was on the link that you sent out on the weekly news there. And it was Rauch. I don't know if I quite agree that this is like one of the most common scriptures, but it is common. I mean, I think there's plenty more of advocacy for others for the sake of our neighbors. But he mentions that don't continue to be afraid, which is usually the tense of it. The many scriptures that say don't be afraid, and recognize that That's why I think it's don't continue, because we're in a state of anxiety, and Jesus isn't meant to shame us for feeling that way, but he is also saying there's some perspective here, and we're not going to accomplish it if we're highly anxious. If we're the most anxious person in the room, we're not going to have the kind of leveled conversations that Annabelle was talking about, and be be a person in the room who is able to say there's got to be some places where we do have some common ground. Like you said, everyone cares about surviving. Just go Maslow on us. Subsistence of people is good. And again, it may be harder for the liberal from like me, from the tree hugging the trees to the widows and aliens that we don't see in our doorstep all the time, to make the case that we have a responsibility to be compassionate and caring towards those. But that basis of common ground of care, maybe something we can work with. So I thanks all.
Beautifully said. I actually thought about putting a section in the sermon about be not afraid. And I thought it was long enough, but I completely agree. And that's very important. Why is it important? Because when we get into fear, our creative brain also freezes up. Our ability to be expansive, to be abundant, to be caring, include other people. So, yes, be not afraid. That's a good place to stop. We've had I think our longest discussion, but it's a timely topic. I'm glad everybody engaged. And we're going to stop now.